The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air as the sun cast its golden rays over Lomita, California. Nestled in the heart of this quiet suburban town was Time Contemporary Cafe, a beacon of culinary delight where patrons gathered to indulge in handcrafted dishes and vibrant conversation. Behind the cafe's success was the seemingly dynamic duo, David Viens, the talented chef with a commanding presence in the kitchen, and Dawn Viens, the cheerful manager whose warm smile greeted every guest at the door. But perfection is often a mask, isn't it? To customers, David was a culinary genius, orchestrating a symphony of flavors that kept them coming back for more. Dawn was his perfect counterpart, ensuring the cafe's operation ran smoothly. Together, they seemed unstoppable. Yet beneath this polished exterior, there were cracks in their foundation, small but undeniable. Dawn had confided to a close friend weeks earlier, her tone strained and heavy. "David, he's not the man I married anymore. Everything feels like it's slipping away." Despite her unease, Dawn carried on, shouldering the weight of both their dreams. She balanced ledgers late into the night, made sure every staff member felt supported, and kept the cafe's charm alive. Her diligence made it difficult for outsiders to notice that her personal life was anything but serene. David, meanwhile, thrived under pressure, or so it seemed. His sharp commands in the kitchen left little room for error, and the staff knew better than to challenge him. He was a man who valued control, every aspect of his life meticulously arranged. But lately his control had begun to waver. Financial strains loomed over the cafe, and whispers among the staff hinted at unpaid bills and mounting debts. It was during one of these whispered conversations that Dawn overheard something troubling, a comment from the head waitress about a large sum of money missing from the cafe's account. At first, she brushed it off as a misunderstanding, but as she reviewed the financial records late that night, the numbers didn't lie. Thousands of dollars were unaccounted for. Dawn's heart sank, her mind raced with possibilities. Had there been a mistake, or was David hiding something? She didn't want to believe it, but the thought gnawed at her. The man she had built a life with had secrets, and those secrets were beginning to surface. "David, we need to talk," she said the next morning, her voice steady but resolute. He barely glanced up from his plate of scrambled eggs, his demeanor dismissive. "What about?" "The cafe's accounts," she pressed. "There's money missing, thousands." David's fork paused mid-air, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. "I'll look into it. It's probably just a miscalculation." But Dawn wasn't convinced. His tone was too even, too rehearsed. She decided to dig deeper, a decision that would set off a chain of events far more sinister than she could have anticipated. The atmosphere at Time Contemporary Cafe remained lively as ever, the facade of perfection carefully maintained. Regulars sipped their lattes, oblivious to the tension simmering just below the surface. To the staff, David's short temper was nothing new. But now, even Dawn's usually warm presence felt distant, her thoughts clouded by doubt and unease. That evening, as the last of the customers filtered out, Dawn lingered by the front counter, staring out the window at the dimly lit street. Her phone buzzed, a text from her daughter, asking if everything was okay. Dawn hesitated before typing back a reassuring lie. "Just tired. Love you." But deep down she knew the truth. The cracks in her life were no longer small. They were growing wider, threatening to swallow everything she had worked so hard to build. And David, her partner, her husband, was at the center of it all. The night was unnervingly quiet, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Dawn stood at the kitchen counter, the spreadsheet of the cafe's finances glowing on her laptop. Her finger hovered over the scroll pad as she scanned through the numbers again and again, each pass confirming what she feared. The missing funds weren't a mistake. Thousands of dollars had been withdrawn, and David was the only one with access. Her chest tightened. The realization wasn't just financial, it was personal. This wasn't a random error. This was betrayal. She closed the laptop with a sharp snap, the sound echoing in the small kitchen. Across the room, David sat in his recliner, nursing a glass of bourbon, his eyes fixed on the muted television. "We need to talk," Dawn said, her voice cutting through the stillness. David didn't look away from the screen. "About what?" Dawn crossed her arms, forcing herself to stay calm. "The cafe's accounts. There's money missing, David, thousands of dollars. What's going on?" His hand tightened around the glass, but his expression remained impassive. I told you, I'll handle it. Probably just a bank error or something. No, Dawn pressed, stepping closer. I've looked through everything. This isn't a mistake. You've been taking money, haven't you? David finally turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. You're overreacting. It's my business too, Dawn. I can do what I need to keep it running. Keep it running? Her voice rose, anger bubbling to the surface. What are you talking about? The cafe is struggling and you're siphoning off money for what? Another one of your projects? His jaw clenched. Watch your tone. Dawn threw her hands up, incredulous. Are you kidding me? Watch my tone? You're stealing from our business, from me, and you expect me to stay quiet? David stood, the glass of bourbon trembling in his hand. I've put everything into that place. Everything. You wouldn't understand the pressure I'm under. And you think I don't feel it? Dawn shot back. I've worked just as hard, David. I've sacrificed just as much. But this, lying, stealing, I won't stand for it. The room crackled with tension. David set the glass down with deliberate force, his gaze locked on hers. What are you going to do, Dawn, huh? Walk away? Good luck keeping that place afloat without me. Dawn's throat tightened, but she refused to back down. Maybe I will walk away. Maybe that's exactly what I need to do. For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Then David's expression darkened, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. You're not going anywhere. Dawn took a step back, her heart pounding. Don't you dare try to stop me. But David was faster. In a blur of movement, he grabbed a roll of duct tape from the counter, his grip ironclad. I said you're not going anywhere, he growled. David, stop! Dawn struggled, her voice trembling with fear. What are you doing? He moved with the precision of someone who had snapped, the logical part of his mind replaced by raw, unrelenting emotion. Before Dawn could break free, her wrists were bound, and he pressed the tape over her mouth. Her muffled cries filled the room, desperation and disbelief etched into her eyes. Just stay quiet, David shouted, his breathing ragged. You always have to push, don't you? Always have to challenge me. Dawn collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down her face as she fought against the restraints. David paced the room, his hands shaking as he raked them through his hair. The gravity of what he'd done began to seep in, but his anger and adrenaline refused to let him stop. The minutes ticked by like hours, the air thick with dread. Dawn's muffled sobs grew weaker as exhaustion overtook her. David slumped into the recliner, his head in his hands, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical force. The man who prided himself on control had lost it entirely, and now the consequences loomed. Outside, the quiet suburban street was undisturbed, the neighbors unaware of the storm brewing behind the Viens' closed doors. But inside, the balance of power had shifted irreparably. Dawn lay motionless on the floor, her breath shallow, her spirit fractured. David stared blankly at the television, the flickering images reflecting in his hollow eyes. The sun rose over Lomita with an unsettling calm, its golden light piercing through the cracks of drawn blinds in the Viens' home. David sat motionless in the recliner, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together, his bloodshot eyes fixated on the floor, but his mind was anywhere but still. The night's events replayed in fragments, her screams, her struggles, and the haunting silence that followed. Get up, he muttered to himself, but his legs felt like lead. The enormity of what he'd done threatened to crush him, yet there was no time for regret. He knew this. Every second he sat there, the world outside continued to move, oblivious to the chaos inside his home. Taking a deep breath, David finally stood and turned to look at the crumpled figure on the living room floor. Dawn lay eerily still, her wrists still bound, her face pale and lifeless. He had hoped, prayed even, that she might still be breathing. But deep down, he knew she was gone. A wave of panic washed over him, making his heart race. His mind jumped to the implications, the police, the cafe, the whispers of a scandal that would ruin everything. He paced the room, running his hands through his disheveled hair. Think, David, think. The first step was clear. He had to remove her body. But where and how? His thoughts spiraled, each solution more grotesque than the last. Then it hit him. The cafe. It was the one place he controlled. The one place he could manage every detail without question. David knelt beside Dawn, his hands trembling as he cut the duct tape from her wrists and ankles. I didn't mean for this to happen, he whispered, though the words offered no solace. He wrapped her body in a thick sheet and tied it securely. The sight of her, reduced to an unrecognizable bundle, made bile rise in his throat. He swallowed hard and dragged her to the garage. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up. A dog barked in the distance. The faint hum of a lawnmower echoed down the street. Every sound felt amplified, every movement beyond the windows a potential witness. David's paranoia grew with each passing second. He opened the trunk of his car and heaved the bundle inside. Sweat dripped down his face as he glanced nervously up and down the street. His neighbors were creatures of routine. He knew their schedules, their habits. He had timed this moment perfectly, or so he thought. As he pulled out of the driveway, his grip on the steering wheel tightened. Each intersection felt like a checkpoint, every passing car a possible threat. He drove the familiar route to the cafe, but today it felt alien. The building loomed ahead, its cheery exterior now a cruel facade for the horror he intended to conceal within its walls. David parked behind the cafe, out of sight. The early morning delivery truck had yet to arrive, giving him a small window to act. He unlocked the back door and peered inside. The stainless steel countertops gleamed under the fluorescent lights, the kitchen sterile and cold. It was perfect, too perfect. Dragging Dawn's body inside, David moved quickly, his motions mechanical. He unwrapped the sheet, avoiding her lifeless gaze as he set her on the floor. For a moment, he hesitated. Could he really do this? But then, his fear overtook his hesitation. Fear of being caught, fear of losing everything. He grabbed a large industrial pot from the storage shelf, its size almost comical in its enormity. It was the same pot he used for his famous stews, the ones customers raved about. Now, it would serve a far darker purpose. The next moments blurred together, a grotesque choreography of panic and determination. David filled the pot with water and turned on the burner. He worked with the precision of a chef, his movements practiced but devoid of humanity. The air grew heavy with steam and David's breathing became shallow as the enormity of his actions sank in. The sound of tires crunching on gravel jolted him out of his trance. The delivery truck. His heart skipped a beat. He hastily cleaned his hands and straightened his apron, forcing his face into a mask of composure. The driver entered, whistling a cheerful tune, oblivious to the unspeakable act unfolding just feet away. "Morning, chef," the driver called out, setting down a box of fresh produce. David managed a weak smile. "Morning, just prepping for tonight's special." "Looks like a busy one," the driver said, nodding toward the boiling pot on the stove. "You're starting early." David's throat tightened. "Yeah, something like that." As the driver left, the door swinging shut behind him, David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The brief encounter left him shaken, his carefully constructed plan already feeling dangerously close to collapse. But there was no turning back now. The kitchen, a sanctuary of culinary art by day, had become an inferno of desperation and darkness. David stood frozen in front of the industrial stove, his reflection staring back at him from the gleaming steel surface of the countertop. The pot simmered violently, steam clouding the room in an oppressive haze. The relentless hiss of the boiling water seemed to echo his spiraling thoughts. Every sound amplified the dread in his chest. A creak from the door, the hum of the freezer, even his own labored breaths. The weight of his actions bore down on him, but fear was louder than guilt. Fear of the questions that would come. Fear of what people would say if they knew what had happened to Dawn. His phone buzzed on the counter, its screen lighting up with a call from the cafe's head waitress. He ignored it. How could he answer now? Instead, he focused on the immediate task, finishing what he'd started. His hands trembled as he gripped the stainless steel handles of the pot. The boiling water lapped at the edges, dangerously close to spilling over. He adjusted the flame, sweat dripping from his forehead despite the early morning chill. The sound of water splashing brought him back to reality. He reached for the long-handled spoon he'd used countless times to stir his signature stews. But this wasn't stew. The thought made his stomach churn. He pushed it down. There was no room for weakness now. As the steam filled the room, it clung to the windows, distorting the view outside. He thought of Dawn, not as she was now, but as she had been. Her laugh, her touch, her fierce determination. Those memories stabbed at his chest like shards of glass. But then he remembered the argument, her threats, the way she'd pushed him too far. "This is your fault," he whispered hoarsely, as if convincing himself. "You made me do this." But no amount of blame shifting could mask the grim reality of his actions. He worked mechanically, each step calculated, every motion deliberate. He wiped the counters obsessively, ensuring no trace would remain. The stainless steel gleamed, its cold surface indifferent to the horrors it now bore witness to. A sudden knock at the back door made him freeze. His heart pounded so loudly he thought the visitor might hear it. Quickly, he grabbed a dish towel and wiped his hands, trying to compose himself. He opened the door to find the cafe's delivery driver standing there, a clipboard in hand and a wide grin on his face. "Morning, chef," the man said cheerfully, oblivious to the tension radiating from David. "Got your order here. Fresh veggies, just like you asked." David forced a smile. "Thanks, just leave it by the counter." The driver nodded, stepping inside and setting down the crates. He paused, glancing at the stove where the pot still boiled furiously. "Starting early today, huh? What's cooking?" David's mouth went dry. He gripped the edge of the counter to steady himself. "Just trying out something new for the menu," he said, his voice strained but steady enough to pass for normal. The driver chuckled. "Well, whatever it is, it smells unique." David's stomach lurched. "Yeah, thanks," he muttered, ushering the man back toward the door. "Appreciate it." As the door swung shut, David exhaled shakily, his composure cracking once more. The driver's cheerful ignorance only deepened the pit of dread in his stomach. He glanced at the clock. The cafe would open in a few hours and the kitchen staff would arrive soon after. He had to work faster. He reached for the drain in the industrial sink, twisting the handle with trembling fingers. The water gurgled loudly as it began to drain, the sound unnervingly similar to a gasp. David's breath hitched, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He wiped his hands on his apron and continued cleaning, his actions precise and methodical, even as his thoughts screamed with chaos. But no plan is flawless, no action without consequence. As the water drained, it backed up unexpectedly. He stared in disbelief as the sink gurgled, spilling murky water back onto the counter. A clog. Panic surged through him. If anyone were to notice, if anyone were to ask questions. He grabbed a plunger and tried to force the blockage loose, sweat dripping into his eyes. The harder he worked, the more stubborn the clog seemed to be. Finally, in a moment of desperation, he grabbed his phone and called a plumber. "Yeah, it's an emergency," he said, his voice tight. "The sink's backed up. I need someone here now." As he hung up, his heart thundered in his chest. The plumber would be here within the hour. David glanced at the boiling pot, then at the clock. Time was running out. Dawn's absence didn't go unnoticed for long. By the end of the week, her closest friends were exchanging worried calls and messages. "Have you heard from her?" one asked another. The replies were always the same. No one had seen or heard from Dawn since the weekend. Her phone went straight to voicemail, and her usual morning updates on social media had fallen silent. At the cafe, David maintained a stoic facade. To the staff, he seemed stressed, but not unusually so. He explained Dawn's absence with a rehearsed calm. She needed a break, he told anyone who asked. She's been overwhelmed with everything lately. A few eyebrows raised, but no one dared challenge him. After all, David's sharp temper was well known. But Dawn's daughter wasn't buying it. She had called her mother's phone multiple times. Each attempt met with the same cold, automated response. Panic gnawed at her as she replayed their last conversation in her mind. Dawn had sounded worried, but had brushed it off with her usual upbeat tone. "I'll call you tomorrow, sweetheart," she had said. That call never came. Unable to ignore her gut feeling, Dawn's daughter contacted the police. At first, the response was measured. Adults occasionally choose to disappear, after all. But as she explained the situation, including David's controlling behavior and her mother's uncharacteristic silence, the officer promised to follow up. Meanwhile, David's lies began to tangle around him. Detectives arrived at the cafe under the guise of a casual visit, observing him closely. "Just routine," one of them assured him, but David's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the counter. They asked about Dawn, their questions pointed but friendly. "She left," David said, his voice steady. "She said she needed space. I haven't heard from her since." "Did she take anything with her?" one detective asked, tilting his head. David hesitated. "Some clothes, I think. I don't know. We didn't exactly part on the best terms." The detectives exchanged a glance, subtle but noticeable. They left shortly after, but their suspicions were now firmly planted. Later that evening, as David scrubbed the kitchen counters for the third time, his phone buzzed with a call. It was one of Dawn's friends. He hesitated before answering, forcing a casual tone. "Hey, David, where is Dawn?" the woman demanded, her voice edged with concern and accusation. "She hasn't called anyone. This isn't like her." "I told you she left," David snapped, his irritation bubbling to the surface. "She said she needed time away. I don't know where she is." "You expect us to believe that?" the friend shot back. She wouldn't just leave without telling her daughter. Something's not right, David. His hand tightened around the phone. Look, I can't help you. I have enough to deal with without you calling and accusing me of... Click. She hung up before he could finish. David slammed the phone down on the counter, his chest heaving. The walls felt as though they were closing in. Every word, every question pushing him closer to the edge. Across town, Dawn's daughter sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through old text messages from her mother. Her eyes welled up as she stopped on a voicemail from weeks ago. She pressed play, Dawn's familiar voice filling the room. I'm okay, the message began. Just tired. Don't worry about me, sweetheart. I'll call you tomorrow. It wasn't much, but it was enough to deepen her conviction. Something was very wrong. She called the detective assigned to the case, her voice firm. Please, you need to do something. My mom wouldn't just leave. You don't know David like I do. Back at the cafe, David couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed story was beginning to unravel. Every glance from a customer, every casual question from an employee felt like an interrogation. He caught himself glancing over his shoulder, his paranoia growing by the hour. The tension reached a peak when one of the detectives returned the next day, this time asking to speak in private. We've had a few concerns raised, the detective began, his tone polite but probing. Nothing serious, just following up. David's stomach churned as he forced a smile. Of course, anything to help. But as the detective's questions grew sharper, his composure began to crack. The web of lies he had spun was becoming a noose, and the noose was tightening. The sun was setting over Lomita, casting a deep orange glow on the quiet streets. But inside Time Contemporary Cafe, the atmosphere was anything but serene. David paced the kitchen, his mind racing. The detective's polite but probing questions from earlier in the day echoed in his head like a warning bell. He felt trapped, cornered by the growing suspicion around him. He knew it was only a matter of time before the veneer of his lies cracked completely. That evening, as the cafe wound down, David couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on him. The staff, the customers, each glance seemed to linger too long. Each conversation felt laden with unspoken accusations. His paranoia mounted when the assistant manager, Lisa, approached him hesitantly. David, she started, her voice low. Is everything okay? You've been distracted lately? David forced a laugh, a sound so hollow it made Lisa shift uncomfortably. It's just the stress, he said, his words clipped. Running this place isn't exactly a walk in the park. Lisa nodded, clearly unconvinced. She lingered for a moment as though weighing whether to say more before walking away. David's eyes followed her retreating figure, his fists clenching at his sides. He couldn't afford questions. Not now. Later that night, as David locked up the cafe, a pair of headlights appeared in the parking lot. His heart skipped a beat. The car parked and two men stepped out, Detective Harper and his partner. They approached with an air of casual authority, their movements deliberate. Evening, Mr. Viens, Harper greeted, his tone cordial but firm. Mind if we have a word? David's grip on the keys tightened. It's late, he replied, his voice strained. Can this wait until tomorrow? Harper smiled faintly. We won't take up too much of your time. Reluctantly, David let them in, his mind scrambling for a way to deflect whatever they had come to ask. Harper's partner began casually surveying the kitchen, his gaze lingering on the gleaming countertops and spotless floor. Harper, meanwhile, leaned against the counter, fixing David with an unrelenting stare. We've been hearing some things, Harper began. Your employees have mentioned you've been on edge, and Dawn's disappearance, it's raised some red flags. David's chest tightened. I've already told you, he snapped. She left. She needed time to herself. And yet, Harper continued, his tone unyielding, she hasn't contacted her daughter or her friends. Doesn't that strike you as odd? David opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Harper pressed on, his eyes narrowing. You know, Mr. Viens, when people vanish, there's usually a trail. Bank transactions, phone records, sightings, but with Dawn, there's nothing. It's as though she disappeared into thin air. David swallowed hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. He knew they were closing in, circling like vultures. He needed to regain control, to steer the narrative back in his favor. She's gone off the grid before, he lied, his voice shaky but defiant. Dawn's always been unpredictable. Harper tilted his head, clearly unimpressed. Unpredictable, sure, but not like this. The tension was palpable. Harper's partner approached, holding up a piece of paper, a printout of surveillance footage from a nearby street. It showed David's car, driving to the cafe late at night on the day Dawn disappeared. "What were you doing here at that hour, Mr. Viens?" Harper asked, his tone sharp. David's throat went dry. "Inventory," he stammered. "The cafe's been busy. I needed to catch up." Harper studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right," he said, pushing off the counter. "But if you think of anything else, anything at all, give us a call." As the detectives left, David sank into a chair, his hands trembling. The walls were closing in, and he knew it. But there was no turning back now. He had come too far, told too many lies. The only way out was forward, even if it meant walking straight into disaster. The interrogation room was sterile and cold, its walls a pale shade of gray that seemed to absorb all warmth. David sat at the steel table, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched. A single bulb flickered above him, casting long shadows on the walls. Across from him sat Detective Harper, calm but focused, his eyes sharp and probing. Harper had dealt with men like David before, men who thought they could outsmart the law, but this wasn't just any case, and Harper wasn't leaving the room without answers. David's palms were slick with sweat as he stared at the blank notebook in front of Harper. He knew what they wanted, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. Not yet. Harper broke the silence first, his voice measured and firm. "David, let's skip the formalities. We both know you're hiding something. The evidence is stacking up. Surveillance footage, employee statements, Dawn's daughter, all roads lead to you." David scoffed, but it lacked conviction. "You don't have anything." Harper leaned forward, his tone softening slightly, but his words carried weight. "David, you've backed yourself into a corner. The only way out now is to come clean. Tell us what happened. Maybe, just maybe, you can salvage what's left of your life." David shook his head, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "I already told you, she left. I don't know where she is." Harper slid a folder across the table and opened it. Inside were crime scene photos, surveillance stills, and a forensic report. He tapped on the report with his pen. "This, David, is what we found in the cafe's kitchen drains. Traces of human tissue. DNA testing confirmed it's Dawn." The words hit David like a freight train. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Harper pressed on, his voice unwavering. "We also know about the late-night trips to the cafe. The footage doesn't lie. So I'll ask you again, where is Dawn?" David's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. His eyes darted to the corners of the room, as if searching for an escape. But there was none. He was trapped, and he knew it. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, until finally he exhaled shakily and whispered, "It wasn't supposed to happen." Harper didn't react, giving David space to continue. The man's facade was crumbling before his eyes, the weight of his lies finally too much to bear. "It was an accident," David said, his voice breaking. "That night we argued. She wouldn't stop yelling. I lost control." "What happened next?" Harper asked, his tone neutral but firm. David's gaze dropped to the table. "I taped her mouth shut. I just wanted her to be quiet, but when I woke up, she wasn't breathing." The room fell silent. Harper let the confession settle before asking the next question. "And then?" David hesitated, tears welling in his eyes. "I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call the police. They'd never believe me, so I took her to the cafe." Harper's pen stopped moving. He leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "Go on?" David swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought if I got rid of the body, no one would find out. I boiled her. In the pot." The admission hung in the air like a dark cloud, its weight suffocating. Harper remained silent, letting David's own words echo in the room. "It was the only way," David said, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't want to do it, but I had no choice." "No choice?" Harper's voice sharpened, cutting through David's self-pity. "You had every choice, David. You chose this." David buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The room seemed smaller now, the walls closing in. Harper stood and collected the folder, his expression grim. "You've just confessed to murder and tampering with a body," Harper said, his voice steady. "This is the end of the road for you, David." As Harper left the room, David remained seated, his head bowed. The weight of his actions, the lies, the betrayals, they had finally caught up to him. And there was no escaping the truth now. The headlines hit the morning news before David could fully grasp the gravity of his confession. His face was everywhere, on the television at the cafe, in the hands of customers reading their morning papers, and circulating endlessly online. "Local chef confesses to wife's gruesome death." The words were damning, inescapable. For the first time since the night it all began, David felt the full weight of his actions. He sat in his car parked behind the cafe, the engine idling. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His lawyer had warned him about the media frenzy, about the unrelenting storm of public outrage, but nothing could prepare him for the way strangers looked at him now, some with disgust, others with morbid curiosity. David's phone buzzed on the dashboard. It was a call from his lawyer. He ignored it, unable to stomach another lecture about cooperation or damage control. He stared at the road ahead, the morning sun glaring through the windshield. Running seemed absurd. Where could he possibly go? And yet the idea lingered. His mind raced with fragmented thoughts. He thought of Dawn, of the cafe, of the life he had meticulously built and then destroyed in a single, irreversible act. He thought of the courtroom, the jury's cold, judgmental stares. He thought of prison. David slammed his fists against the steering wheel, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. He couldn't face it. He couldn't face any of it. Gripping the gear shift, he threw the car into drive and sped out of the parking lot, tires screeching against the pavement. His destination wasn't clear. He didn't have a plan. All he knew was that he needed to escape, away from the stairs, away from the questions, away from the truth. Police cruisers began their pursuit just minutes later. The news of his confession had already reached law enforcement, and an APB was issued as soon as he left his lawyer's office that morning. The flashing lights in his rearview mirror only fueled his desperation. "Pull over, David," the voice from the patrol car's loudspeaker commanded. "This is your last warning." David's heart pounded in his chest, his hands shaking on the wheel. He swerved recklessly through traffic, his vision blurred by adrenaline and tears. The weight of everything, his guilt, his fear, his anger, pressed down on him like a vice. As he approached the cliffs overlooking Rancho Palos Verdes, his options dwindled. The road narrowed, the ocean stretched out before him, vast and unforgiving. He could hear the sirens closing in, their wails piercing the still morning air. David slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just feet from the cliff's edge. The patrol cars surrounded him, their doors flung open as officers took cover, weapons drawn. But David wasn't looking at them. He wasn't hearing their commands to step out of the vehicle. His eyes were fixed on the horizon where the ocean met the sky. In a single, frantic motion, David threw open the car door and bolted toward the edge. "Don't do it!" one officer shouted, but his plea fell on deaf ears. David's feet pounded against the dirt, his breath ragged, his mind a blur of chaos. The wind roared in his ears as he reached the cliff's edge and leapt. For a brief moment, everything was silent. The weightlessness was almost peaceful, a stark contrast to the storm that had consumed his life. But peace was fleeting. The impact came swiftly and brutally, shattering bones and leaving him crumpled on the rocky shore below. Against all odds, David was still alive, barely. The officers climbed down, their faces grim as they approached his broken form. Blood pooled around him, his breath shallow and labored. He opened his eyes briefly, his gaze unfocused as one officer radioed for an ambulance. David had tried to escape, but there was no escaping the truth, not anymore. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with reporters, curious onlookers, and the somber faces of Dawn's family and friends. The heavy silence was broken only by the shuffle of papers, the murmurs of attorneys, and the rhythmic tapping of the judge's gavel as the proceedings began. David sat at the defense table, his once commanding presence reduced to a pale shadow of itself. His eyes rarely lifted from the surface of the polished wood in front of him. The prosecution wasted no time painting a vivid picture of the man seated before the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," the lead prosecutor began, her voice clear and measured. "What we have here is not just a case of murder. It's a story of control, deceit, and the lengths one man went to in order to erase the evidence of his crime." Her words hung in the air as she gestured toward the crime scene photos projected on the screen. The gruesome images elicited audible gasps from the gallery. Dawn's family clutched one another, their faces etched with grief. David's lawyer rose to counter the narrative, his tone measured but firm. What happened was a tragedy, a horrible accident, not a premeditated crime. My client acted out of fear and panic, not malice. The courtroom was divided, whispers circulating as each side presented its case. But it was the forensic evidence that delivered the first major blow to David's defense. A forensic analyst took the stand detailing how DNA recovered from the cafe's plumbing matched Dawn's. The analyst's calm, methodical explanation contrasted sharply with the horrifying implications of the evidence. "Can you confirm," the prosecutor asked, her voice unwavering, "that the biological material recovered could only have come from Dawn Viens?" "Yes," the analyst replied. "The DNA match is conclusive." David's lawyer objected, attempting to challenge the chain of custody, but the damage was done. The jury shifted in their seats, the weight of the evidence unmistakable. Then came the most emotional testimony of the trial, Dawn's daughter. She walked to the stand with a strength that belied her grief, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "My mom was my best friend," she began, her voice breaking slightly. "She was kind, funny, and hardworking. She didn't deserve this." Tears streamed down her face as she described the days following her mother's disappearance. The endless calls, the sleepless nights, the gnawing sense that something was horribly wrong. "I knew it was him," she said, pointing at David. "I knew he'd done something to her." David sat motionless, his face blank, but his hands betrayed him, clenching and unclenching beneath the table. The jury watched him closely, their expressions unreadable. The prosecution's final blow came with David's own confession played in court. His voice, shaky but clear, echoed through the room as he described the night of the argument, the boiling pot, and the desperate cover-up. Gasps filled the courtroom as the recording concluded, the reality of his actions laid bare. In his closing arguments, David's lawyer appealed to the jury's humanity. "David Viens is not a monster," he said, his voice earnest. "He's a man who made a terrible mistake in a moment of panic. While his actions cannot be excused, they should be understood." But the prosecution's rebuttal was swift and cutting. "David Viens didn't make a mistake," the prosecutor declared. "He made a series of deliberate choices to silence his wife, to dispose of her body, and to lie to everyone who cared about her. Those are not the actions of a panicked man. They are the actions of a killer." The jury deliberated for hours, their decision weighing heavily on their shoulders. When they finally returned, the air in the courtroom was electric with anticipation. "Have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreman stood, his face grave. "We have, Your Honor." David's eyes remained fixed on the table as the verdict was read. "We find the defendant, David Viens, guilty of second-degree murder." The room erupted, some in relief, others in muffled sobs. Dawn's daughter clutched her aunt, tears streaming down her face. David's shoulders slumped, the reality of his fate sinking in. As the gavel struck one final time, the judge addressed the courtroom. "Let this case serve as a reminder that justice, though delayed, will always find its way." David was led away in handcuffs, his head bowed as Dawn's family embraced. The chapter of their pain was far from over, but for the first time in years, they had a semblance of closure. The months following David's conviction were a whirlwind of media coverage, legal commentary, and community reflection. The trial may have ended, but for those closest to Dawn, the wounds remained fresh. The headlines faded, replaced by newer scandals, but the scars left by David's actions would never truly disappear. Dawn's daughter found herself at the center of the storm, juggling her grief with the unwanted attention that came with the case. Each time she stepped out of her home, she felt the weight of strangers' stares, their whispers trailing behind her. Still, she refused to let her mother's story fade into obscurity. At a local domestic violence awareness event held in Dawn's honor, her daughter took the stage. Her voice, though steady, carried the weight of loss and determination. "My mother didn't deserve what happened to her. No one does. If you or someone you know feels trapped, please, don't wait. Speak up. There are people who will help." The audience, a mix of survivors and advocates, erupted into applause. Dawn's story had become more than a tragedy. It was a rallying cry, a beacon for others to recognize the signs of abuse and control before it was too late. Meanwhile, the cafe that once symbolized success and community was permanently shuttered. Its windows were boarded up. The cheerful sign that once read "Time Contemporary Cafe" now faded and forgotten. For the residents of Lomita, the building became a haunting reminder of the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. Detective Harper, sitting in his cluttered office late one evening, reflected on the case that had consumed his life for months. Despite the conviction, he couldn't shake the lingering questions. How many opportunities had been missed to save Dawn? How many warning signs had gone unnoticed by those closest to her? He flipped through a folder of photos, pausing on an image of Dawn taken years before her marriage to David. She was smiling brightly, her eyes full of hope. Harper sighed deeply, closing the folder. "We failed her," he muttered, the admission heavy on his conscience. But we can do better. David, now serving his sentence in a state prison, spent his days in near total isolation. The other inmates avoided him, not out of fear but disgust. In their eyes, his crime was beyond comprehension. Left alone with his thoughts, David began to unravel. His journal, found during the investigation, revealed a man consumed by control, resentment, and paranoia. A far cry from the charismatic chef the community once admired. "I loved her," he wrote in one entry, "but she didn't listen, she didn't understand me. I had no choice." The words, haunting in their detachment, were analyzed by psychologists, dissected in true crime documentaries, and debated in classrooms as an example of how toxic control can escalate into violence. For Dawn's family, the journey toward healing was slow and arduous. Her sister described the pain of organizing a memorial without remains to bury. "It feels unfinished," she said, "like she's still out there waiting to be found." Despite the anguish, they clung to each other, finding solace in shared memories of Dawn's kindness, her laughter, and her unwavering love for her daughter. In the years that followed, Dawn's story became a case study for law enforcement and advocacy groups. Her name appeared in training manuals, her photo displayed in presentations about recognizing the subtle signs of domestic abuse. Her life, though tragically cut short, became a symbol of resilience and the urgent need for intervention. As the sun set over Lomita, the town's streets quieted once more. The cafe remained dark, its emptiness a stark contrast to its once vibrant atmosphere. But in homes across the community, conversations about Dawn sparked change. Neighbors checking in on one another, families discussing the importance of communication and support. Dawn Viens was gone, but her story would not be forgotten. In the lives she inspired and the awareness she raised, her legacy endured, a lasting reminder that even in the face of unspeakable tragedy, there is always hope for change.